is to see how this idea has developed in our culture, to see how rival readings of the concept have been contested, how different understandings have emerged in this battle of concepts, which is the history of moral and political philosophy. And so that's what I'm going to try to attempt this evening. Obviously, though, that's a vast undertaking, and I've got to try and bring these materials under some kind of control. So what I've decided to do is to concentrate on how the concept or the expression of the concept has been examined in modern Anglophone thought. Now, that is not necessarily because I think that the Anglophone case is the most interesting one, but it is what I know about, and after many years of lecturing, I've decided it's probably best to talk about what one knows about. But now, in case that may seem too parochial, just to take the Anglophone case, I should say what is obvious, and it's partly obvious because of the role that this particular country has played in the modern world, and it's an Anglophone country. It so happens that the Anglophone understanding of this concept has become of surpassing importance in current times. Now, within the Anglophone tradition, the earliest treatise in which the concept of civil or political liberty is systematically analysed is also, as it happens, perhaps the most important work of Anglophone political philosophy, namely Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, first published in 1651. Chapter 21 of this great work is entitled Of the Liberty of Subjects, and that chapter really inaugurates the modern debate about social freedom. So I'm going to start with it. Now, a further merit of starting with Hobbes, this is always true in Anglophone political philosophy, is that his understanding of this particular concept, that of civil liberty, turned out to be extraordinarily influential. So that his analysis is also an extremely familiar one, as you will see if we look at my first slide. As you see, I've called this the liberal concept, and as you also see, it's an extremely simple concept. It just has two components. It proposes that for an individual to enjoy freedom as a citizen of a state, there must be first power on the part of this individual to act in pursuit of a given option. Option might be too broad, so let's just say an alternative. And secondly, there must be no interference with the exercise of this power by any external agencies. So let's just take these two ideas in turn. First of all, power. This is not a lecture about power. That would be perhaps a more important lecture to give, but notice that I'm going to talk now about power, but subsequently about freedom. There's a huge question, of course, about how we want to nest those two concepts. Now, Hobbes insists on that very question, and I think valuably, that it makes no sense to talk about freedom of action except in relation to your having a power to act. So if you lack the power to act in a certain way, I don't know what, the power to walk on water, shall we say, then Hobbes would say, well, you're neither free to walk on water, nor are you unfree to walk on water. The question of freedom does not arise, and that is because you are powerless to walk on water. So questions of freedom are always nested within questions about power. Foucault's point, or rather Hobbes's point, taken from Hobbes by Foucault. And to put this point the other way round, which will thereby bring out its significance, if you are unfree to act in some way, that must be because you have been disempowered. Okay, so there's the proposed relationship between power and freedom. That unfreedom is your having been disempowered by some identifiable external agencies. Now I turn to the second component of the idea. The claim here is, in effect, as you can see, how to understand the core idea of disempowerment. You're said to be disempowered and hence unfree if and only if some other agency, we want to keep the predication wide, some agency, could be a natural agency, human agency, if this agent interferes with you in the exercise of a power which counterfactually you possess. So on this analysis, you can put it very simply indeed. What is social freedom? It is absence of interference. Good. I've been making my debut as a teacher in an American university this semester, so the question is, well, what grade would you give that? I think that's a B so far. That does not get us very far, because if freedom is absence of interference, it turns out, freedom being a negative concept, we want some positivity in here. It turns out that what we really need to understand is the concept of interference. What do we mean, interference? That's not a clear concept. Well, of course, Hobbes has thought about that. He's not a B student, and here it comes. According to Hobbes's analysis, an external agent is said to interfere when they act upon the body of an individual in such a way that an action counterfactually within the power of that individual is either prevented or compelled due to the application of physical force by the external agency in such a way as to render the pursuit of any alternative impossible. Hobbes summarizes in chapter 21 of the Leviathan, freedom is simply the absence of external impediments of motion. So there's the Hobbesian analysis. Let's contemplate it, if I may ask you, for a moment. And as soon as you contemplate it, you will notice that it contains a massively counterintuitive implication. It's said to be only bodily interference that takes away freedom of action. And the implication, obviously, is that if it's only your will and not your body that's coerced, as, for example, if you obey the law for fear of the consequences of disobedience, then on this analysis, when you obey the law, you nevertheless act completely freely, and you're completely free to disobey. As Hobbes summarizes again, chapter 21, fear and liberty are consistent. Now, that's obviously counterintuitive, but Hobbes really means it. And he illustrates it, or you can illustrate it. He doesn't happen to take this example, but it's very common in 17th century philosophy, and John Locke explicitly takes it in his treatises of government, that of the highwayman who points the gun and says, your money or your life. Now, Hobbes says, when you decide to hand over your money, don't forget you were offered a choice. You could have handed over your life, so when you hand over your money, don't say you didn't act willingly. You had a choice, and freedom is choice. Hobbes has a very nasty joke at this moment. He says, when you think about it, you act in this type of case not only willingly, but very willingly. Now, that way of thinking about social freedom is at large in political philosophy in the Anglophone tradition at this day. And indeed, it is the approach adopted in two of the most ambitious recent works in the analytical tradition on the theory of freedom. I'm thinking of Ian Carter's book, The Measure of Freedom, 1999, or Matthew Kramer's major treatise, The Quality of Freedom, 2003, which would, it's a very important book. It would be even better if it had less criticisms of me in it. But my point is simply that this genealogical strand comes right down to our time. There are Hobbesians. Okay, that may be so, but the immediate reaction to Hobbes's theory was that there's something obviously wrong with it. And I want to turn to that critique, especially as it brings me, this is all going to be genealogy, to the most celebrated work of Anglophone political philosophy of the next generation, namely John Locke's, I've already mentioned it, two treatises of government, first published in 1690. Now, Locke agrees that, of course, you are unfree to act if you are bodily prevented from exercising a power. I mean, it would be very strange to deny that. You would have to be talking about freedom of thought and not freedom of action before you could even make sense of that. I mean, the paradigm of lacking freedom of action is surely being in a locked room. You're physically prevented from leaving. Nobody doubts that. What Locke wants to say is what's gone wrong here is that, of course, you are also unfree if your will has been coerced. Here is Locke, paragraph 176. Should a robber break into my house and, with a dagger at my throat, make me seal documents to convey my estate to him, would that give him any title? Well, the question is intended to be purely rhetorical, for what Locke wants you to see is that this is a predicament in which what you have to say is you have no real choice. That's not to say that it's impossible to refuse, which is what Hobbes would want to say, But the relevant act, Locke wants to say, is going to be so unappealing that it will not be possible to say that you freely performed it if you did perform it. So the addition of Locke's suggestion makes our genealogy look like this. I've now got Hobbes right over on the left wing, which is not where he wants to be, of course. But I have added Locke's notion. And here and throughout this lecture, when I add to the genealogies, I will put it in bold so that we can see how the story is evolving. And Locke's rival claim, in bold, is that unfreedom arises when there's either the interference I've spoken of, or else when there is coercion of the will in such a way that, in Locke's nice phrase, my will is bent to your designs. If you bend my will to your designs, that is a species of unfreedom. Right. Well now, we're now dealing with a new concept. Notice that not only made no appearance, but it's the great strength of Hobbes's analysis that it did not need to make any appearance in his account of freedom, which is a completely unanalyzed notion we've suddenly fetched up with coercion. What does that mean? It's a completely unclear concept. Hobbes notices that, of course, and he wants to get rid of it because he wants everything to be very hard-edged. But if you think that the Lockean story is intuitively appealing, which most of us surely would, then you've got to think about coercion. That is what it turns out you've got to be able to grasp above all. Now, that being so, it's rather remarkable that John Locke never offers an analysis of what he means by coercion. He just offers some examples. I list them from paragraph 222 of the second treatise: threats, promises, offers, bribes. These are all means, he says, of bending the will. Well, if you meditate for a moment on that list, you're going to see, aren't you, that we have to have an analysis. I mean, they may all be bendings of the will, but are they all coercive? I mean, take the case of the politician who accepts a bribe. A bribe is one of Locke's examples of bending the will. But in a court of law, when the politician is up for having accepted the bribe, if he says, well, look, it was so enormous, I really had no alternative. That's not going to work, is it? And so what that shows us is we need an analysis of what forms of bending of the will are to count as coercive. And as I say, Locke doesn't provide that. And as far as I can see, the earliest legal philosopher in the Anglophone tradition who does provide it is Jeremy Bentham, in his treatise entitled On the Limits of the Penal Branch of Legislature, which was written in the early 1780s. So my genealogy is now moving from the late 17th into the late 18th century. Well, Bentham proposes that we need to distinguish between two ways in which you might bend someone's will. One is that you might promise them a reward for compliance with your will. Now, if they refuse that, they are no worse off. Now, contrast that with the case where instead of promising them a reward for compliance, you promise them a penalty for non-compliance, so that if they refuse, they will be worse off. Now, Bentham's proposal is that we can properly speak of coercion only in the first type of case. And the reasoning is that in these cases, the action becomes, a nice phrase he uses, ineligible. That's to say, you would never freely choose to perform this action simply because it would leave you worse off, and in certain circumstances, very much worse off. So if you perform it, there must have been duress. And so that's coercion, by contrast with the first type of case, which he calls allurement. So you have duress versus allurement. Now, actually, that doesn't quite work, I think, because there can surely be promises of benefits that we might nevertheless want in a course of law to call coercive. But I do think that what's clever about Bentham's suggestion is that he's isolated the paradigm case of coercive behavior, namely issuing a threat. Although, as he rightly points out, and Bentham loves distinctions, as I'm sure you know, there must be certain characteristics that attach to this threat. I mean, first of all, it must be credible, or else it won't affect your will. Secondly, it must be immediate, since it leaves you no alternative. And thirdly, it must be serious. So you think, I'm really going to have to evade this somehow. Now, if you can't evade it and have to act, you have acted under a threat such that you have unquestionably been coerced. And I think that is a paradigm, and I think that it's therefore worth adding it to our chart. So there's the notion of ineligibility, and the paradigm is the serious, immediate, and credible threat. Okay, is that the analysis of social freedom that you want? I mean, if it is, this is a very short lecture. In fact, I'm exactly halfway through, so the answer is no. But the answer is that many distinguished philosophers think the answer is yes, and if, for instance, you take what has been the most influential single discussion of my theme this evening in Anglophone philosophy in our time, namely Isaiah Berlin's celebrated talk, paper, lecture, Two Concepts of Liberty, the preferred concept of liberty with which that famous lecture ends, you're now looking at. So that story also comes down to our time. However, within the liberal tradition, there arose a further complicating moment just a generation after Bentham had written, when John Stuart Mill published what is still perhaps the best known treatise on my topic this evening in our language, in the English language, I mean, his essay on liberty, 1859. One of the moves that Mill makes in this famous essay is to point out that the liberal tradition so far endorses one principle that he thinks questionable. And there it is at the top of our chart, at the middle of the top of our chart, that freedom consists in the interference with the exercise of your powers by external agencies. Notice no one has doubted that. All the arrows, if you reversed them, would go up to there. So an external agency, another person in the Anglo-Saxon law sense of the term, or a fictive person, the state, or a natural agency, any of these could be external agencies, but that is the sort of force that we have to be talking about if we're talking about interference with freedom of action. Now, Mill wants to ask, and he puts the point in chapter 3 of the essay, is it true, though, that freedom is necessarily interpersonal? All of this presupposes that freedom is an interpersonal notion. Is it necessarily so? Or could it be that the agent who takes away your freedom somehow could be you? Could it be you? Well, as soon as you entertain that thought, the liberal tradition begins to look more complicated. And that complication is what gets developed in later 19th century social philosophy, as successive attempts are made to make sense of this extension of the notion of interference. So here it is. We're now entertaining the thought that it may not be an inherently interpersonal concept, but that the interference might be by the self preventing or compelling action due to the operation of, well, what? That now is the question. How could you make sense of the thought that the self could undermine the freedom of the self? I mean, what notion of the self have you got here? Well, this is now where we enter really deep philosophical waters. And some very interesting work has been done on the issues about personal identity, which are here presupposed. I'm going to be very schematic here and simply say that we can distinguish, I think without being overcrude, three answers to that question, which became a deep preoccupation of social philosophy in the generations after Mill. Here is one thought. The impact of an overpowering emotion. Now, this thought is certainly present in Mill, but this is an ancient thought. This is a Platonist thought. This is a thought as old as the Timaeus. The key suggestion being in the geography of the soul that you find in that great work, that the will can ally itself either with the passions of the soul, in which case the resulting action will be an expression not of freedom, not of liberty, but of license, or the will can attach itself to reason, in which case the will can attach itself to reason, in which case the resulting action will be a case not of license but of genuine liberty. So notice the intimate conceptual connection here suggested between freedom and reason. Only actions undertaken out of reason on this account are free. Now, that doctrine tends to be associated above all with the philosophy of Kant, but as I've said, it's a classical view, and it's strongly present throughout what's sometimes called the rationalist tradition in early modern philosophy. For example, it's a central doctrine of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, that we are born free as we are born rational, as he says. But I don't think that's the proximate source of Mill's insight. Rather, I think Mill is moved by the thought that, as he says at the very beginning of his essay, in our day, he means mid-19th century Britain, the yoke of law is lighter, but the yoke of opinion is heavier than hitherto. And I think that's right, that in the earlier discussions I talked about, the usual enemy is the state, and we're thinking about ourselves as subjects of a state, as Hobbes says, the liberty of a subject. And the relationship is one of law. But Mill, like his elder contemporary Tocqueville, is much more impressed by the capacity, which is hardly mentioned in early modern philosophy, early modern legal social philosophy, of civil society itself to become an agent of our unfreedom by demanding conformity to its conventions and norms. And so the thought is that the way that you could render yourself unfree would be by inauthentically internalizing those conventions and norms. Here's how Mill puts it. I'm quoting chapter 3. The people of England think themselves free, but they choose what is customary in preference to their inclinations until it does not occur to them to have any inclinations except for what is customary. Then the mind itself becomes bound to the yoke. You've created your own unfreedom. Let me round off this part of the discussion with a third possibility, although this will for a moment cause me to skid off the purely Anglophone tract, but here it is. The capacity that you have to undermine your own freedom of action by acting falsely to your real interests, to your human interests. Notice that Mill comes very close to saying this when he talks about the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. But of course, the classic expression of false consciousness is to be found in the social philosophy of Marx, and in our own time, in those writers of the Frankfurt School, and above all, Habermas, who have taken up this aspect of Marxist philosophy. The suggestion here, especially amongst the modern German tradition of questioning consumer society, using Marxist tools to question consumerism, is that if, as Marx tells us in Capital, social being determines consciousness, and if your consciousness is determined by a society in which your freedom of action is conceived in consumerist terms, then you will be liable to become the agent of your own servitude by endorsing a consumerist, and hence, these writers would want to say, a false view of what is in fact in your own real interests. Now, what makes that a deep problem is, of course, can we make sense of the notion of a real interest as opposed to a phenomenal desire? If you think you can, then you may well think that C is rightly there on the list. Okay, now we've got quite an array of ways about thinking of social freedom, but notice that they have one idea in common to all of them, so that if you reverse the arrows, you get it. They all run up to one source, which is no interference. Nobody has doubted that. Everything goes back to that. But towards the end of the 19th century, which is where my genealogy has now reached, a number of Anglophone political philosophers began to argue that this analysis that we're looking at is kind of radically incomplete. It has somehow missed the point. And the Anglophone writers who pick up this thought are drawing here especially on the philosophy of Hegel, who says in a memorable passage in part 3 of the Philosophy of Right that if that's your view of freedom, as he says, only the English could be so crude. This hasn't started, is what the Hegelian story wants to say. And that is because, they insist, this idea that freedom is a negative concept, that it's marked by an absence, no interference, hence a negative concept, this is the negative moment in a dialectic. Freedom is a dialectical moment. a dialectical concept. And what we have to ask is, what do we want this absence of impediment for? What's it all about? And that's what this doesn't address. Well, you might say, well, it does address it because it's at the top of the chart. It's given alternatives. Furthermore, you might think that it's the glory of liberal political philosophy by contrast with Hegelian or indeed Marxist philosophy that it takes very seriously that the aspiration when we're talking about freedom is to leave you to do what you desire, as long as Mill says, it's within the bounds of the harm principle. So the freedom is filled out, the liberal will want to say, because it's filled out with the notion that freedom is doing what you want. The Hegelian answer, as you know, is very different, and it remains with us in social philosophy to this day. According to this rival view of things, you want your freedom not merely in order to be able to act at will, but rather in order to act in such a way as will realize the essence of your nature. Well, there you are staring into another huge philosophical abyss. And also notice we're now looking at a wide conceptual gulf which is opened up between this and the freedoms that I've so far talked about. So far we've talked about freedom as a negative concept, but here is an attempt to give it a positive content. So nothing to do with non-interference. Freedom is about self-realization. Realizing the essence of your nature. Now, you may think this doesn't make any sense. This presupposes that human nature itself is normative and that it makes sense to speak of some actions as inhuman and some as human. But of course we do talk like that, don't we? So you can't simply dismiss this out of hand. And if you think it worth considering whether human nature itself might be normative, then there are going to be as many different theories of what you might call positive liberty, what Hegel does call positive liberty, as there are views about what constitutes the essence of human nature. And if you look at our broadest intellectual frameworks in the West, we have entertained two such thoughts over millennia. One stemming from classical philosophy and the other from Christianity. Here's a further Nietzschean thought. Christianity is the usurpation of classical philosophy in exactly the juncture that I now want to talk about. And here is the classical view. The Zoon Politikon, Aristotle's claim, man is the political animal. You realize your nature most fully and are therefore most a free person when you devote yourself to the exercise of your talents in the public sphere. But of course, according to the Christian view that subverts that, what Nietzsche wanted to call the slave morality, that subverts this image of public service in classical philosophy, we realize our natures not in the service of the community, but in the service of God. And it is in the service of God, here's the Stoic paradox, it's in the service of God that you attain perfect freedom. So there's Luther's idea of the freedom of the Christian. So there is the rival thought. Now, obviously, that second thought is not a political one at all, but if you go back to A, you come to the heart of positive theories of freedom, and as I say, they're with us in our time. The most celebrated philosopher who has articulated exactly that view of freedom is, of course, Hannah Arendt, especially in her book Between Past and Future. I quote her, "Freedom consists in politics." Freedom consists in politics. How is that? Because the activity of self-government and the virtues that that requires is the activity in which we most fully realize our natures, and freedom consists in that realization. Now, of this classification, and indeed of all of them, I want to say that I'm not suggesting that I've said anything exhaustive here, and indeed the very notion of an exhaustive classification is obviously absurd. All right, I want to pause at this point because I think it would be quite generally agreed in contemporary political philosophy that we are now looking at about as full an account of different views of social freedom as could coherently be given. But why I'm standing here this evening is that I still think the story hasn't got going. I think that none of this is what we should be talking about. And I want to end by saying what I think we should be talking about. I promised to speak for 45 minutes, which is what I shall do. We started 5 minutes early, so I have 10 minutes to go. Don't worry, I'll make it. Look, I can begin to suggest what's still missing by going back to Hobbes. You need to know something about Hobbes which his commentators don't usually tell us, which is that when he says freedom is just no interference, this is a phenomenally contentious claim. What he's trying to do is to discredit a rival theory in which freedom had been conceived in completely different terms, terms owing everything to the text which I've come to think is really the founding text in legal philosophy of our culture, and that is the Codex of Roman Law. That is not a contentious claim. I mean, everybody agrees that that is the founding text of our legal arrangements. Now, the digest of the Roman Law starts by making the most basic distinction you want to make in law, which is who's subject to it. And so it starts with the distinction between two types of personae, the persona of the free person, the liber homo, and the persona of the slave. And according to this view, of course, anyone who is a slave is ex hypothesi unfree. If you don't agree with that, you've lost your grip on a concept. But the question is, what makes a slave unfree? Now, don't answer being coerced. A slave who only ever does his or her master's or ruler's, remember, bidding, might never suffer any coercive interference whatever, or indeed even any threat of it. So what makes that slave unfree? And the answer is, as the Roman law expresses it, the mere fact of having a master is what makes you unfree, because that is what it is to live in dependence upon the arbitrary will of someone else. And that is slavery. What slavery is and what makes a slave unfree is nothing to do with being interfered with, which may or may not happen, but this. And that's how we should think about social freedom. So the suggestion is that you will not be a liber homo, you will not be a free man or woman, but you will rather be in some kind of servitude, at least in certain domains of your life, if the following two conditions obtain. If there could be interference contrary to your interests, and secondly and connectedly, if that is due to your living in dependence upon the arbitrary will of someone else. Now, notice, of course, that resembles the liberal picture in that it figures freedom as a negative concept. But it says the negativity is not interference, it's dependence. And notice the crucial difference between these two schools of thought, because on the theory I'm now looking at, you could be unfree even if there's no interference or even threat of it. Now, that claim can look absurd, and that's the word that Matthew Kramer uses about me in his book. How could there be loss of freedom when there's no interference? Well, the neo-Roman answer, or rather two answers, is as follows. One, the mere fact of living in dependence on somebody else's will takes away autonomy, because you never act freely. All your actions, as a matter of fact, have the character of permissions. So you have servitude in that domain. But secondly, and crucially, no one could live for very long in this existential predicament without realizing that they had. Of course, you could. In a slave society, you might be born a slave and you would only come to see all this. But you couldn't live for long without seeing all of this. But as soon as you see all of this, you're going to self-censor, because you are sure drastically to limit your own range of freedom of action. Now, the way that that works, here's the thought, is that if you are in any domain of your life at someone else's mercy, what that means is you've no idea what might happen to you. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's all right. But you don't know. That's the horror of slavery. You don't know what might happen. Anything could happen. But if that's so, you're going to make it a major project in your life to try to keep out of trouble. And the way to do that is to self-censor. You're going to find out what you think is wanted. You're going to do exactly that. You're not going to do anything else. It's just like not having tenure. In fact, it is not having tenure. That would be a very good example. You're going to self-censor in the name of not getting into trouble in circumstances in which you are in someone's power. So for this tradition, here's the big question. Well, this has been the main story in the modern West about social freedom, but this story never really died. There's a kind of rocky descent, and it's a revolutionary theory that we're now talking about. And the first revolution in which it became central was the English Revolution of the 17th century, and here is the first answer that's given. All who live as subjects of monarchs live as slaves. This is James Harrington's view, the greatest of the English Republican writers, very influential, of course, in this country in the 18th century, in his Oceana. Why? All monarchs have prerogative powers. They have discretionary executive powers. But discretionary executive powers are arbitrary. They are somebody's will. But to live subject to somebody's arbitrary will is what slavery is. So you can only be free in a republic. Here is a second answer, which became very important with the rise of the European empires in the early modern period. All who live in colonies under imperial powers live as slaves. The core of the argument of 13 colonies in 1776 was that if you are governed and especially taxed by a colonial power but have no representation in the legislative which is imposing those taxes, that is to say that you are wholly dependent on the goodwill of that legislative for the level of taxation imposed. But, the colonists insisted, that takes away liberty because that leaves you at the mercy of the imperial power. As Priestley was to put it, if they can take what they want, they could take your last penny. Now, the reply of the British government was to say, but you can trust us not to. So what Tony Blair always used to say, trust me. And you think, what? That's the colonists' response. Why should we have to trust you? It's the relationship of dependence and domination which is wrong, which is why the Declaration of 1776 was called a Declaration of Independence. Independence from what? Well, dependence, of course, upon the arbitrary will of the executive in Great Britain. So this thought about freedom is the founding thought of the American Republic. Here's another point that became extremely important in the revolutionary decades immediately following. All women who do not have independent means live in the manner of slaves. That is the thesis of Mary Wollstonecraft's extraordinary text of 1792, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Women, wholly dependent as they are economically upon men, have to devote their lives to finding out how to commend themselves to men. They're at their mercy. This makes them servile. This makes them slavish in disposition. The language of slavery is what suffuses that text. And more amazingly, it's also what suffuses the last of John Stuart Mill's text. It isn't sufficiently often pointed out that Mill changes his mind about social freedom. His last text of 1869 is called The Subjection of Women. And he says of the fact that in the English law of the time, no woman had the power to make a will. Notice the deep pun. How can she have a will if she can't make a will? He says, I see no difference between their condition and that of the bond slave. How about this? What about if you employ illegal immigrants? How are they going to be able to protest against unfair working practices? It's not going to be possible. The condition of dependence is too extreme. How about this? Turns out that a number of democratic states are practicing, without the consent or even knowledge of their citizens, systematic powers of surveillance. The government of my country, in admitting to the use of these powers, has said two things that seem to me well worth noting. First, and here I quote the Foreign Secretary in the House of Parliament, you have nothing to worry about provided that you've done nothing wrong. Now, notice that that is to concede that there are things which, were you to say them in your emails, would definitely get you into trouble. It's just that they're not telling you what they are. But they are telling you that it's they who are going to tell you when you're in trouble. Second, they insist that in these dangerous times there has to be a trade-off between these admitted invasions of privacy and the needs of public security. And Jennifer already spoke about this in the wonderful first lecture that we heard this afternoon, where she said this is construed as a privacy issue. And of course, she's absolutely right. It is not a privacy issue. It is a freedom of speech issue. And once we start to realize that, we should treat the trade-off very differently. It is, of course, an affront to privacy, but I'm standing here to tell you that it's an affront to freedom, because if citizens begin to self-censor in the face of these powers, because, for example, of not knowing what use may be used of their emails and wanting to be sure of keeping out of trouble, they will have limited their own freedom of expression. They will have colluded in the undermining of their freedom. Well, on that gloomy note, I draw to a close. Our freedoms are in jeopardy, but I just want to end by making 2 points about my complete chart, which is what you're now looking at, and I'll leave it fully complete, that's to say remove all the bold type, and see how it looks. I just want to make 2 concluding points here, and then I end. One is that as far as I can see, all 3 of the species and all of the varieties of those species of views of freedom that I've talked about this evening are coherent on their own terms. But, as you can very easily see with the or, they are not mutually compatible. You've got to choose. So here I leave you with this thought: which view should you embrace? Now, here's the most important thing I want to say, which is that I have not come here this evening to this greatest of research institutes to tell anyone what I think they should think. What I've tried to do here is what Wittgenstein used to call assembling reminders. In fact, if you think about it, you probably knew everything that you're looking at. I've assembled these reminders for you in a certain way. In doing so, what I've shown is, or at least I've gestured at showing, how the concept of freedom has been handled in our modern Anglophone traditions of thought. But as to how it should be handled, well, that question I must leave to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.